On a wet June morning in 1852, behind a sugar warehouse in New Orleans, a little black girl was put on the auction block with no surname, no family, and no value anyone in the room could agree on. The bidding died at $2. $2 for a child. But the auctioneer made one mistake. He let her keep the small tin box she had sewn shut with red thread. And inside that box was not a toy, not a prayer charm, not a keepsake. It was a map of stolen people. Names, dates, river routes, bills of sale, free papers copied before they were burned. A record so dangerous that men with judges in their pockets, banks behind them, and slave ships in their ledgers would spend the next 40 years trying to make sure that child never learned how to read it. Her name would later become Baptiste. But on the day she was sold, the record called her only one word: girl. New Orleans knew how to make cruelty look ordinary. By sunrise, the levee already smelled of molasses, horse sweat, fish rot, tobacco, and wet rope. Barrels rolled down the planks. Steamboats breathed smoke into the humid air. Men in linen suits complained about prices as if the city were built on weather and arithmetic instead of flesh. The warehouse on Girard Street was not one of the grand auction rooms tourists whispered about years later. It was smaller, meaner, practical. A place used when sellers wanted a transaction finished before too many eyes could remember it. The auctioneer was Emile Caron, a man with careful hair, polished boots, and a gift for turning human beings into inventory without once changing his tone. He had 6 people to sell that morning. 5 were listed properly: a cook from Plaquemines Parish, 2 field hands from a debt seizure, a laundress whose owner had died, a teenage boy with a scar over his left eye. And then there was the child. No age verified, no origin verified, no owner willing to sign his full name. Just a small girl with dark brown skin, bare feet, a torn blue dress, and both hands locked around a flat tobacco tin wrapped so tightly in red thread that the metal edges had cut into her palm. Caron asked where she came from. The trader shrugged. Up from the coast. Mother gone. Papers confused. That was what men said when the truth would cost them money. The girl did not cry. That unsettled them more than crying would have. She watched. She watched the doors, the ledgers, the buyers, the key ring on Caron's belt. She watched the trader's hands whenever he came near the tin box. Every time he reached for it, her body went rigid, like a small animal ready to bite. "What's in it?" Caron asked. The trader spat into the mud. "Trash. Cloth scraps. Women's nonsense. She screams if you take it." Caron tried once. The child bit him hard enough to draw blood. The buyers laughed, and the laughter killed whatever price she might have brought. Nobody wanted a child too young for labor, too silent for obedience, and too fierce over a piece of tin. So the bidding fell. $5. 3. 2. Then silence. Caron was about to close the sale to no one when a man stepped out from the edge of the warehouse shade. He was black, broad-shouldered, dressed like a river hand who had learned to carry himself carefully around white men. His name, though Caron did not write it down, was Jonah Vail. Jonah worked steamboats between New Orleans, Natchez, Cairo, and Cincinnati. To most men on the levee, he was just a pilot's assistant, with calloused hands and a patient face. But Jonah knew the code of the river. He knew which cabins hid fugitives beneath sacks of meal. He knew which captains looked away for a price. And he knew red thread when he saw it. Because in certain houses, among enslaved women, who could not safely keep paper, red thread meant one thing. "Remember." Jonah lifted $2 silver. "I'll take the girl." Caron frowned, and the box. Jonah did not look at it too quickly. "If she comes with it, she comes with it." The trader looked relieved. Caron looked annoyed. The sale was marked in the ledger with a line so thin it nearly vanished. Female child, approximate age 7, defective temper. Sold $2. That was all the city meant to remember. But Mara remembered the smell of wet rope. She remembered blood on the auctioneer's finger. And she remembered the first words Jonah Vale whispered when he bent down and took her hand. "Don't open it here." They left New Orleans that afternoon on a northbound steamer hauling sugar barrels and military cloth. Mara sat between sacks of cornmeal near the engine room, the tin box pressed under her ribs. Jonah brought her water, hard bread, and a strip of dried apple. He did not ask for her name. On the second night, when the river was black, and the deck lanterns swung in the wind, Mara finally spoke. "My mother said not to let men read the red." Jonah kept his eyes on the dark water. "Then we won't let them. Are you taking me back?" "No." "Are you selling me?" Jonah turned then. "No, child. I bought time. Not you." That was the first mercy she understood. Not freedom yet. Not safety. Just time. The journey north took 3 weeks, because safe travel never followed straight lines. Jonah left one boat in Natchez, took a wagon road outside the city, hid Mara for 2 days in a smokehouse owned by a free black carpenter, then boarded another vessel under a different name. Twice, men came aboard asking about a girl with a tin box. Not a girl of a certain height. Not a girl with a certain scar. A girl with a tin box. Jonah heard them and changed routes. By July, he delivered Mara to a brick church in Cincinnati where the basement smelled of coal smoke, soap, and damp wool. The woman who opened the door was Ruth Bowden, a widow, a teacher, and one of those people history often misfiles as kind, when the more accurate word is dangerous. Ruth taught free black children by day. By night, she taught fugitives how to write their names before the world tried to steal them again. Jonah placed a small pouch of coins on Ruth's table. "She came out of New Orleans," he said. "Men are already looking." Ruth looked at Mara, then at the tin box. "What is inside?" Jonah answered carefully, "Something women died to keep." Ruth did not ask another question. That was why Jonah trusted her. For 2 years, Mara slept on a pallet behind Ruth Bowden's classroom. She learned letters from chalk dust and Bible pages. She learned sums by counting coal pieces. She learned to read newspaper columns about laws written by men who would never have survived one night inside the system they defended. But the tin box remained closed. Not because Mara was obedient, because she was terrified. Her mother, Adeline Baptiste, had sewn the red thread around that lid with a needle made from a fish bone. Mara could still see her hands moving in the weak light of a slave pen room, quick and calm while men shouted below. Adeline had been a seamstress in the household of a Gulf Coast broker. That meant she handled cuffs, waistcoats, coat linings, and travel bags for men who believed a woman bent over fabric was too small to notice business. They were wrong. Adeline noticed everything. She noticed which free papers disappeared after a black sailor was arrested. She noticed which children arrived with northern accents and left with new names. She noticed ship captains paid in cash when the cargo could not be written plainly. She noticed judges visiting after midnight. She noticed that ledgers told 2 stories, one for the law and one for profit. So Adeline began copying the second story. Not onto paper. Paper was too easy to find. She copied names into hems. She stitched numbers inside waistbands. She marked dates with thread knots, and hid scraps inside a tobacco tin that once belonged to a white clerk who had thrown it away. Some scraps were cloth. Some were rice paper. Some were torn margins from bills of sale. Together they formed a record of a quiet machinery. Free black people kidnapped from river towns, renamed in New Orleans, moved through false debts, and sold into parishes where nobody would hear them protest. Adeline did not write like a lawyer. She wrote like a mother who understood that the future might need directions back to the crime. When fever took her in the holding rooms near the levee, she pressed the tin into Mara's hands. "Red means remember," she said. Then she made her daughter repeat it until the words became bone. "Red means remember." Ruth Bowden was the first person Mara allowed near the box. Not to open it, just to examine the stitches. Ruth recognized some of the marks. A line of 3 knots could mean march. A double cross stitch could mean a courthouse. A blue loop could mean river transfer. This was not random sewing. It was a ledger built by women who had been denied ledgers. Ruth's face changed as she understood. "This is evidence," she whispered. Mara did not know that word yet. Evidence. It sounded heavy. It sounded like something men could still burn. By 1857, Mara was 12 years old and reading well enough to understand the Dred Scott decision when Ruth read it aloud in the basement. Black people, the court said, had no rights white men were bound to respect. The room went silent. Mara walked upstairs, took the tin box from beneath a loose floorboard, and brought it down. "Then my mother was writing against the whole country," she said. Ruth looked at her for a long time. "Yes," she said, "and that means we have to learn how to read every stitch." They spent the next winter doing exactly that. Ruth taught Mara to translate thread into words. Mara copied the marks into notebooks. Names emerged first. Solomon Pike, Eliza Grange, the Northup Boys. Celeste Marchand. 3 children listed in one scrap as taken near Portsmouth, Freeborn, papers destroyed. Then places. Gallipolis, Louisville, Vicksburg, Algiers Point. Then dates. May 3, 1844, January 11, 1846. September 8, 1849. Then firms. Not full names at first, initials, abbreviations, broker marks, insurance references, doc numbers. The kind of details only someone inside a trader's office could have copied. Ruth became very still when one firm appeared again and again. Hale, Pritchard & Rowe, a respectable shipping house with offices in New Orleans, St. Louis, and Baltimore. A company that publicly handled cotton, sugar, and marine insurance. A company that privately made money converting free people into property. Mara did not fully understand the scale yet. Ruth did. That night she barred the church doors. 3 days later, a man came asking questions. He said he was looking for a missing child from Louisiana. He wore a clean coat and spoke with a lawyer's softness. He asked if any girl had arrived from the lower river with a small metal box. Ruth smiled like a woman who had spent half her life lying to slave catchers. "We teach many children," she said. "None belong to you." The man returned with 2 others after midnight. They broke the side door. Ruth had expected that too. By the time they entered the basement, Mara was already hidden behind a coal wall in the neighboring cellar with the tin box tied beneath her dress. Ruth stood at the bottom of the stairs holding a shotgun older than the church itself. The men searched for less than 10 minutes before footsteps sounded in the alley. Black men from the neighborhood, armed with hammers, axe handles, and one rusted pistol, filled the back entrance. The intruders left, but the message had arrived. The box was no longer a memory. It was a target. Ruth sent Mara away before dawn, not far at first. A safe house in Oberlin, then another near Cleveland, then a farm outside Chatham in Canada West, where fugitives spoke of the South as if it were a storm, still visible on the horizon. Mara hated leaving Ruth, but Ruth made the choice plain. If you stay, they will come back with badges. If you go, the truth still moves. So Mara moved. She carried the tin box through snow, mud, fear, and years. By the time the war came in 1861, Mara was 16, working as a seamstress under the name Mara Reed in a boarding house near Detroit. She earned small money. She spoke little about her childhood. She trusted almost no one, but she had kept copying. Every thread mark became a written line. Every written line became an index. Every index pointed toward a crime. The country split itself open that spring. Fort Sumter fell, regiments formed, newspapers printed maps. Men who had called slavery a local matter suddenly discovered that local matters could fire cannons. And information became a weapon. In late 1862, a Union provost officer named Captain Elias Venn found Mara through the same river network that had once hidden her. He came to the boarding house in civilian clothes, but he carried himself like someone used to giving orders. "I'm told you have records concerning Gulf shipping houses," he said. Mara kept sewing. "I repair coats. I'm told the records connect certain firms to illegal seizures of free Negroes." The needle stopped. "Who told you that?" "People who think the Union can use the truth." Mara finally looked up. "The Union uses many things, then drops them when they become inconvenient." Venn did not deny it. That was the first reason she listened. He explained what he wanted. Confederate supply lines depended on old commercial networks. Shipping houses that once moved enslaved people now moved credit, cotton, medicine, and military information. If Mara's records proved which firms were built on illegal traffic, Washington could pressure their northern partners, freeze assets, and expose Confederate sympathizers hiding behind respectable business. It sounded practical. It sounded patriotic. It also sounded like the kind of thing men said right before taking a woman's evidence and erasing her name. So, Mara made the same choice her mother would have made. She gave him a copy, not the tin. For 12 nights, she stayed awake transcribing the red thread records into a ledger of her own. She translated knots, cloth marks, initials, and scraps into plain English. She added everything she had learned from newspapers, city directories, and courthouse notices. When Venn returned, she slid the copy across the table. "The original stays with me." Then opened the ledger. His expression changed before he reached the second page. "This names judges." "Yes." "And insurers." "Yes." "And a Baltimore congressman's brother." Mara threaded her needle. "Then read carefully." Venn took the copy. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. A brick came through Mara's window with one sentence tied around it. "Women who read too much die young." Her employer dismissed her the next morning, apologizing the whole time but still dismissing her. Men followed her through the market. Letters she sent to Canada arrived opened. A rooming house turned her away after a stranger paid the owner a visit. Then Ruth Bowden's church in Cincinnati burned. No one was killed in the flames, but Ruth inhaled smoke trying to save her student records. She died 3 days later. The official report called it a stove accident. Mara received the news in a rented attic in Detroit and sat on the floor until the candle burned out. She had spent years believing the box was dangerous because of what men might do to her. Now she understood the deeper cruelty. Truth did not only endanger the person who carried it. It endangered everyone who helped carry the carrier. For a month, Mara disappeared. She left Detroit under a false name and traveled to a contraband camp near Cairo, Illinois, where thousands of formerly enslaved people were living between war and freedom. There she mended uniforms, sewed tents, and listened. She listened to women describe children sold south. She listened to men recite names they refused to forget. She listened to soldiers explain how officers lost paperwork for black recruits, but never lost payroll for white ones. And slowly, the tin box changed in her mind. It was no longer just her mother's memory. It was part of a larger testimony, a country of stolen names trying to speak at once. In the summer of 1863, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg turned the war's direction, a black journalist named Caroline Mercer found Mara in Cairo. Caroline wrote for a newspaper in Philadelphia. She had read fragments of the ledger Captain Venn had passed through military hands, and she had noticed what everyone else had missed. The record was not simply useful to the war. It was useful after the war. Because if slavery ended without proof of how it had been built, the men who profited from it would call themselves unfortunate inheritors of an old system. They would claim distance. They would claim innocence. They would claim nobody could have known. Caroline Mercer had no patience for that kind of lie. When she met Mara, she did not ask for the box first. She asked for Adeline's name. That was the second mercy Mara understood. Some people wanted evidence. Caroline wanted the woman who made it to exist. Together, they began again. Not as rumor, not as memory alone, as proof. Caroline used newspaper contacts in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cincinnati, and Union-held New Orleans. Clerks quietly copied port entries. Black church leaders sent baptism records. A former insurance clerk mailed marine policy numbers under no return address. A Union quartermaster in New Orleans sent a list of warehouse leases tied to Hale, Pritchard, and Rowe. The red thread told them where to look. The archives told them the thread had been right. One case became the center. In 1846, a free black carpenter named Solomon Pike had traveled from Ohio to New Orleans with signed papers and 3 letters of reference. The official record said he died of fever before returning north. Adeline's thread record said something else. It gave a dock number, a broker mark, a false name, and a sale date 10 days after his supposed death. Caroline found the sale. Solomon Pike had not died. He had been renamed Samuel, sold into a sugar parish, and insured for $600. His free papers had been destroyed. His tools had been sold separately. His wife in Ohio had mourned a man who was still alive in Louisiana under another man's name. When Mara read the confirmation, she stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. "That is what my mother knew," she said. Caroline looked at the papers spread across the table. "No," she said. "That is what your mother proved." The first article appeared in February 1864, under a title that traveled faster than anyone expected. The Red Thread Papers. It did not begin with outrage. It began with Solomon Pike, a man with papers, a man with witnesses, a man with a trade, a wife, a route, and a name. Then it showed how a profitable machine turned him into inventory. The article moved from one case to another. Not too many at once, just enough to make denial difficult. Solomon Pike. Eliza Grange, taken near Louisville. The 3 Portsmouth children. A sailor from Boston, listed as dead on one sheet and sold under another name on another. Then came the firms. Then came the judges. Then came the insurers. Then came the respectable families, whose money had been washed clean by time. The response was violent. Caroline's office was ransacked. A printer was beaten in an alley. A white editor who reprinted the story lost advertisers overnight. Mara's name was not used in the first articles, but the men who had hunted the tin box understood anyway. They sent a letter to the newspaper. Produce the original or admit the fraud. Caroline wanted to refuse. Mara did not. "No," Mara said. "They have spent my whole life saying women like my mother could not make records. Let them look at what she made." But she set terms. The tin box would be opened in front of witnesses. 2 black ministers, a Union legal officer, 3 clerks familiar with Gulf records, and 1 textile expert who could testify that the stitching was old, not a new invention made for war. The meeting took place in a guarded room at the Philadelphia newspaper office. Mara placed the tin on the table. The red thread had darkened with age. The metal had rusted along one edge. Her own hand trembled when she cut the first stitch. No one spoke. Inside were folded cloth strips, tiny paper scraps, and a flattened brass button wrapped in linen. The button bore the mark of Hale, Pritchard, and Rowe. The textile expert examined the knots with a magnifying glass. The clerks compared the dates. The legal officer checked the sale references against copies from New Orleans. Hour by hour, the room changed. Skepticism became discomfort. Discomfort became silence. Silence became recognition. One clerk, an older white man who had spent 30 years around commercial records, finally pushed his chair back and removed his spectacles. "These marks match the broker shorthand," he said. "Not all of it, but enough." The Union officer asked, "Enough for what?" The clerk looked at Mara. "Enough to prove somebody inside that office was copying what the office never intended the public to see." Caroline wrote that sentence down. It became the line that made the story impossible to contain. By April 1864, the articles had reached Washington. Not because every politician cared about stolen black lives. Many did not. They cared because names in the red thread papers overlapped with Confederate finance, Northern banking, and wartime supply contracts. Suddenly, moral evidence had become financial evidence, and Washington was very good at noticing money. Mara was asked to testify before a wartime inquiry panel. She traveled by train with Caroline, the tin box locked in a leather satchel beneath her skirt. Washington was mud, soldiers, hospitals, and unfinished promises. Men in uniform crowded the streets. Wagons carried amputated limbs away from army hospitals. Newly freed people moved through the capital with bundles on their backs, looking for work, relatives, or simply a place where no one could legally drag them south. The hearing room smelled of coal and wet wool. A senator from a border state tried to smile, as if kindness were the same as respect. "Miss Reed," he said, using the name she had chosen after escape, "are we to believe that your mother, an enslaved seamstress, secretly built a commercial archive with thread?" Mara met his eyes. "No, sir." A murmur went through the room. Caroline stiffened. Mara continued, "You are to believe that men who thought a seamstress was furniture spoke freely in front of her. You are to believe that a woman who handled their coats could count the papers they hid inside them. You are to believe that a mother who knew her child might live in a country of liars made a record in the only language she was allowed to keep." The room went quiet. Then she opened the tin. She did not cry while explaining it. That mattered. Men who expected grief could dismiss grief as female excess. Men who expected rage could dismiss rage as instability. But Mara gave them dates, names, marks, copies, connections. She gave them the cold shape of theft. Caroline testified next, explaining the verification work. She showed where thread marks led to port ledgers, where port ledgers led to insurance records, where insurance records led to family fortunes still sitting in northern banks. The inquiry did not deliver the justice Mara wanted. It did not arrest every man. It did not restore every stolen person. It did not return every child. But it did one thing that could not be undone. It entered Adeline Baptiste's record into public evidence, not as folklore, not as abolitionist exaggeration, as a documented map of a criminal trade hidden inside the legal one. For the first time since her mother's death, Mara felt the burden shift, not disappear, shift. A truth carried by one child had become too heavy for one child to carry alone. The war ended the next year. Church bells rang. People shouted in the streets. Newspapers printed the word freedom, as if printing it made the thing complete. Mara knew better. Freedom on paper was powerful, but paper had failed black people before. Free papers had been burned in New Orleans. Marriage papers ignored. Pay papers lost. Contracts altered. Birth records denied. The lesson of the red thread was not that paper meant nothing. The lesson was that paper needed witnesses. It needed memory. It needed people willing to guard it when law became convenient and history became polite. After Appomattox, Mara traveled south with Caroline and a group of teachers working among free people along the Mississippi. She carried copies of the red thread papers into camps, churches, and schoolrooms. Wherever she went, people brought names. A grandmother looking for 2 grandsons sold through Vicksburg. A veteran searching for a sister renamed in Louisiana. A woman who still remembered the lullaby her stolen brother used to hum. Not every name could be found. Most could not. That was the cruelty numbers never showed. Records could prove a crime and still fail to resurrect the life that crime had scattered. But sometimes the thread held. In 1866, near Baton Rouge, an old man heard Mara read the name Solomon Pike from the article. He began shaking before she finished. He was not Solomon, but he had worked beside him. Solomon had died in 1859, he said, still insisting his real wife lived in Ohio, still carving the initials EP into scraps of wood because he was afraid the world would forget Eliza Pike had ever been his wife. Mara sent the news north. It was terrible news. It was also an answer. Eliza Pike, who had spent 20 years suspended between widowhood and uncertainty, finally learned that her husband had not abandoned her, had not vanished willingly, had not been careless with his papers. He had been stolen. When Caroline published that follow-up, readers wrote that it broke their hearts. Mara thought that was too simple. Some truths do not break the heart. They give the heart back its proper wound. For several years, the Red Thread papers did what evidence can do when the world is briefly willing to look. They helped teachers build lessons. They helped ministers name crimes from the pulpit. They helped families challenge false histories. They pressured one shipping heir in Baltimore to donate a warehouse for a freedmen's school after Caroline uncovered his grandfather's account books. They forced Hale, Pritchard, and Roe to dissolve under public disgrace, though most of its partners quietly moved their money elsewhere and continue calling themselves gentlemen. That was another lesson Mara learned. Exposure is not the same as repair. A revealed system does not vanish because people gasp at it. It changes clothes. By the 1870s, Reconstruction began to buckle. The promises made in wartime rooms weakened under violence, fatigue, and political bargaining. Men who had lost the right to own bodies found new ways to control labor, land, votes, and fear. Caroline kept writing until frets and exhaustion bent her health. Mara kept teaching. She married a Black Army veteran named Daniel Reed, who had lost 2 fingers at Port Hudson and believed, as Mara did, that children should learn the alphabet before the world taught them obedience. They opened a small school outside Cincinnati. On the first day, Mara placed the tin box on a shelf where the older students could see it. She did not open it. Not yet. She told them only this. This is why you learn to read. Years passed. The children grew. Some became teachers. One became a printer. One became a lawyer who carried a copy of the Red Thread papers into court when defending black families against fraudulent labor contracts. Mara never became famous in the way newspapers make people famous. Fame would have made the story too simple. A child sold for $2 becomes a heroine, and everyone applauds, and the country is forgiven for noticing late. Mara did not want applause. She wanted custody of the truth. In 1894, with her hands stiff from age and sewing, she prepared the final archive. The tin box, the cloth strips, Caroline's articles, Ruth Bowden's letters, Jonah Vale's river note, the only proof he had ever existed beyond Mara's memory. Copies of inquiry testimony, names of the known kidnapped, names of the missing, names of the men who profited. On the first page, Mara wrote her mother's name in full. Adeline Baptiste, seamstress, mother, witness. Then beneath it she wrote one sentence. She was not silent. They simply did not know how to read her. That sentence became the archive's key. Mara died in 1908, old enough to see laws rise that tried to narrow freedom again, old enough to know that truth did not win once and stay won. But the red thread remained. Students studied it. Families copied from it. Teachers carried the story into classrooms where children learned that history was not only presidents, battles, and laws, but also a woman bending over cloth in a room full of criminals, making sure their own confidence became evidence against them. And every time someone asked how a 7-year-old girl sold for $2 could trouble men with money, judges, ships, and guns, the answer was there in the stitches. They thought value was what the auctioneer named. They thought history was what the ledger admitted. They thought a mother with a needle could not threaten an empire built on paper. They were wrong. They thought they were burying paper. They had not understood thread.